Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Alchemic Materials panel. As sort of an introduction, I thought I'd sketch out a bit of the lineage of thinking that brought a number of us together in the past to talk about this topic or this subject. For me, this really started when I was doing research for the Artifact exhibition, which took place last year in February, which was called The Act of Magic. And together with co-curator Ilse Huygens, we brought together 20-some artists to really think about what this concept of magic could mean in contemporary society. And subsequently, we were invited by the Brakke Grond and Fiber to rework the exhibition in response to obviously the spaces in the Brakke Grond, but also in relation to the theme and topic of Fiber, which was prima materia, alchemical thinking and making in art, design and music. So on alchemy and magic in the Brakke Grond explored how concepts such as alchemy and magic can perhaps help us to understand or influence our relationship to the complex systems and technologies that govern everyday life in this society. Both in the conference as well as in certain artworks involved in the exhibition, we explored the parallels between contemporary designers and perhaps the practices of early alchemists. In one of the works in the exhibition, the one-hour radio show titled Haunted Machines Alchemy, which was produced by the curators of this Impakt Festival, Tobias and Natalie, the statement was made that, and I quote, all these practices, they were referring to the practices of contemporary designers working in the fields such as Martin Halsey and Erika Scotti, Alexander Daisy Ginsburg, Wesley Goatley, but perhaps it's also applicable to the practices of Füsun, Pieter and Krystal. All these practices seek to build connection and meaning to things that might otherwise seem intractable, disconnected or distant. In that, they are so like alchemy, in trying to structure and understand the relative relationships and matter of the stuff that makes up the world, end quote. So this panel will continue to build on this statement or premise, asking questions such as what is contemporary alchemy and how can the narratives surrounding the history of alchemy be used to reassess our current relationship with materials, transformation and power. So let me briefly introduce the first speaker, which is Füsun Türetken. Turn page. Füsun is an architect and visual artist from Istanbul. She's head of visual culture and lecturer at Piet Zwart Institute and a 2016 fellow at Nieuw Instituut. She's completing her PhD at the Center for Research Architecture in the Department of Visual Culture at Goldsmiths, London. And besides her academic endeavors, she has built quite an elaborate practice as curator and writer, and of course as a visual artist, running, amongst other Studio Features, a platform that hacks into contemporary conditions of institutions by supporting collaborative work. Please help me in welcoming Füsun.
Is it up there, the presentation? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Füsun, and I would like to speak a little bit about what you've just seen at the in the film, Alchemic Desire. And maybe I have to frame it before I start speaking about it. So it's part of my PhD at Goldsmiths. And the PhD title is Alchemic Dialogue on the Most Powerful Catalyst on the Planet. And what I'm doing in that research is basically I'm looking at capital in conflict through the lens of metal, or what metal plays not only as a sort of agency in those matters, but also how it moves around us humans, as I think you could beautifully see in the film. So let me start by reading a little bit. I have only 20 minutes, and I think I might be finished with the paper already in 10, and then we can see what we do with the rest of the time. Yeah. But actually, I might not even need it. So if you can just put it up, it's fine. Yeah, thank you. So metal is a substance that, embedded in the strata of geological history of this earth, has borne witness to the evolution of humankind. In this instance, we understand the fluid nature of metal, its mutability, ability to morph from solid to liquid state, flowing through strata of the earth as it flows through markets and exchanges. metal exists also in an alchemical state, in a proto-material manifestation of desire. And with the word of desire, I also touch upon the notion of Deleuze and Guattari's thinking about desire in terms of capitalist and desire. The London Metal Exchange, which you have just seen, is the material manifestation of a financial system and its flows that we often consider immaterial. Here, in this last open outcry trading floor, where decisions are made in a world of numbers and arithmetic, a predominantly masculine world, considered to be based on ratio, we find that alchemy, in fact, is a contemporary mode of operation that is elemental in current systems of finance. It is, in fact, a steady companion. Deriving from medieval times, it is present until today, where it is part of the material expressions and the speculative mechanizations of the world of finance. Alchemy and its failed attempts to cure all ills, achieve immortality, and transform any base metal into the noblest metal, gold, lives on not through physical and chemical experiments, but through alchemic desire. The alchemic dream opens up a metallurgic understanding of the forces and flows of capitalism and power, through which we can understand the ongoing processes through which metal, as the most powerful catalyst, I argue, in the world operates. Metal, in fact, is the conductor of all matter. And of course, I base this thinking on Deleuze and Guattari, and I also salute a colleague whom I greatly admire, which is Reza Negarastrani, and he, in his book Cyclonopedia, looks at oil as a lubricant of all matter and how it forms also, the geopolitical strata of the Middle East. Whereas the medieval symbols of alchemy can be found in variation with the digital depictions in the pit of the London Metal Exchange, which you've just seen, the press officer at LME believes these signs are invented. In fact, they are copies of alchemists who have never charged any claim to their copyright. Digging into the semiotics of these symbols, one finds that they are aligned to certain features. Gold is aligned with the sun, silver with the moon, iron with Mars, Mars being the very red planet, colored through its crust being filled with iron. Iron and Mars also being associated with swords, weapons, and war. Harmony and generosity with gold and silver. Alchemists did not only desire to transmute base metals into gold and silver, but also desired to multiply the recipe, to find the philosopher's stone, of course, to maximize the amount while minimizing the ingredients. The desire to make more profit is another analogy to the greed performed in the world of finance. This world of finance was based upon the concept of bimetallism until the early 20th century. It referred to the same two metals which formed the monetary unit in which the value was defined as equivalent to certain quantities of gold and silver, creating a fixed rate of exchange between them. Every day now we watch announcements of the shares of gold going up in value when another election crisis lies ahead of us. Walking on the grounds of London today, a city formed by finance and its financial district, one understands that the subterranean area of the Bank of England forms a huge vault filled with gold and silver, still forming the base of capital and state power, creating fantasies of gold heists and otherworldly expeditions and colonial pasts and desire. These are the subterranean ghosts that are roaring and were calling us earlier in the film. The LME, the world's biggest physical metals exchange, is one of the few remaining venues to retain an active trading floor of the type made famous in the 1983 movie Trading Places alongside electronic dealing. The company's new headquarters in London is in contrast to other commodity exchanges such as grains and oils, which has moved to almost an entirely electronic market. Sorry, there's a mistake in the sentence, basically. It's still a very old-fashioned stock exchange. The ring is designed around the dealer's office booth, where electronic trading takes place at the same time. Trading is recorded by the microphones and video cameras in the case of any dispute. Time is extended and reduced at the same time in the striated space of the London Metal Exchange,
which itself is constructed and based on a skeleton of aluminum grid. It is filled with technological devices made of metallic salts and crystals forming black liquid crystal screens with ever-changing digits in different colors. Metallic microphones building a sky ring, replacing the stars and the zodiac signs that the alchemists refer to when staging and crafting their metals. This sky ring that you've seen with the hanging microphones records or records every word and shout, which are fed into a black box, saved for a certain amount of time, to then be deleted the very same day. Wires, cables, digits, traders, metals everywhere. A modern Circus Maximus with gladiators in their daily uniform, their suits, roaring, performing metallic life, holding metal pens. Their modern armory replacing the ancient heavy metal swords and weapons. It is in this little circle and enclosed forum in which the metals are traded in rings of 5 minutes each. It is in this very arena where the ghosts of the deterritorialized matter and metal are moving humans like marionettes, puppets, day in and day out, attached to their metallic wires. In the London Metal Exchange, the medieval blacksmith is replaced by the trader. Now the trader's hands are oily, and his skin or her skin shines of salty mineral sweat while trading large amounts of chunks of aluminum, lead, zinc, gold, and silver, to feed the desire of the industry. The exchange simultaneously happens via physical agents in the trading floor called the pit. A reminder of the mining pit where the earth metals derive from via telephone trading or online trading, all flows are collapsing and unfolding into these rings of trade, each metal achieving 5 minutes of stardom. The name for the open outcry trading floor is the ring, the circle, the ring of time, the circle ring on the ceiling, the constitution of the central perspective, gives the space an analytical and narrative power. Deleuze, or according to Deleuze, in architectural space, the vertical is the first geometrically structuring element to appear, and from then on the most persistent one. The vertical direction, which is this one, not to be confused with the horizontal, the vertical direction coincides with the main axis of the body, which you can also find in the alchemic drawings, and has particular emotional effects. The fear of depth and the experience of height is elevated. For these reasons, the vertical acquires a symbolic meaning denoting centers. The axis mundi of much mythology that you will see as well in the film. And I have to say, in the first edit of the film, I had some alchemical drawings, which I deleted in the second edit. In the ring, and I'm coming to close soon, in the ring the floor traders sit on red leather benches, shouting bids and offers across the floor, during 5-minute trading for each metal, as I said before, supplemented by their hand signals. It is a practice that dates back to the early 19th century, when metal merchants moved from the Royal Exchange to the Jerusalem Coffee House in Cornhill in London City. Those with metal to sell would draw a circle in the dust or sawdust on the floor around which traders would gather to make their bids and offers. But electronic and telephone trading has long overtaken the practice. Only about 10% of the LME's trading takes place on the ring, with the rest evenly split between electronic and telephone trading. The LME states that its complicated date structure, which allows traders to buy features daily up to 3 months, weekly for 6 months, and monthly for up to 10 years, creates a need for human traders. Outlook. I'm jumping into the future and the present, or from the present into a speculation. On March 2017 of this year, valued at $1,276, bitcoins were for the first time worth more than gold ingots valued at $1,227. So basically there is a difference of $49, if I'm not mistaken. And in the history of our contemporary world of finance and real and digital lives, the entire Bitcoin system, the coins themselves, mining, trading, and transactions, all exist also in the virtual realm, mostly immaterial, we would think, and without any physical correlate. How is it that a currency that is based on a computer code, that is essentially on some lines of text and digits, could become more valuable than gold? In brackets, one cannot ignore that gold in fact can be considered worthless too, but is desired, admired, fetishized in songs and commercials, and our visual culture of production, and is thought to be indestructible. Bracket closes. Yet, the world of finance, a world of numbers, speculations, and speed, has created the conditions for the accelerated valuation of immaterial objects, brackets, as bitcoins, bracket closes. Yet this interrelation is itself based on the agency and dynamism of matter, that is, of metal. And I argue our desire continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Füsun. I'll quickly introduce our next speaker, which is Pieter van Boheemen. He's a hacker, artist, engineer, researcher, and teacher from the Netherlands. He's currently working for the Dutch Rathenau Institute after having directed many years the Open Wet Lab, the Open Design Lab, and Fab Lab Amsterdam at Waag Society. Until very recently, I'd say. He organized dozens of hands-on art science do-it-together bio workshops, funded and led more than 150 Dutch DIY bio community events, ran the microorganism store Pet Shop, and presented a YouTube channel on making and hacking things. He coordinated several European research projects with his group at Waag Society and participated in KICS, Making Sense, Brain Hacks, and Dittos. Needless to say, Pieter is an expert in biological technologies. He's an award-winning entrepreneur and world-recognized speaker on biohacking and DIY bio. His primary interest, though, is in driving forward free and open-source technologies as a catalyzer for social innovation. So let's put our hands together for Pieter.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. It's a bit low. Okay. I'm happy to be here to talk about reassessing our relationship with living materials, because I believe there's nothing more, related to alchemy than trying to create life itself. Turning lead into gold is one thing, but how about turning non-living material into living material? And I think that currently this boundary between those two worlds of the non-living and the living is diminishing through the progress of technology and science. And that results in a lot of questions to us as a society. And having researched that hands-on for the last couple of years, I recently moved to the Rathenau Institute. And I'm now more focusing on policy options that can be thought of while being confronted with these developments. So I'd like to take you first on a small journey on how did we get into this biotech world by going briefly through a history of genetic engineering, which is a subset of biotechnology. And I think it will help you to also think about the possible futures of this technology, and maybe also think about questions that we can discuss in the panel. So, arguably, you could start thinking about genetic engineering as of 1953 with the discovery of the double helix. Most people know that Rosalind Franklin made this picture. It's made of a crystal of DNA. It's an X-ray diffraction pattern. And then Watson and Crick figured out that it had to be caused by a double helix. So they figured out that how life stores information in a three-dimensional structure. And it was a couple of years later, let's say 1967, when the glue was discovered for gluing back broken pieces of DNA. And 3 years later, enzymes called restriction enzymes were discovered that can cut DNA. So as of that moment in time, scientists were able to cut and paste DNA, and not just from inside one organism, but also from species to species. So we could take a gene from a plant and introduce it into an animal, or the other way around. And the first successful applications were, let's say, in the 70s, when transgenic mice were made. I couldn't find any picture of the mouse, but still, the scientist that made it, there's a picture of him around. So these technologies were first applied to animals. And interesting, only 4 years later, we discovered a way to actually read DNA, to actually know which parts exactly that were being copy and pasted. And that was invented by Dr. Sanger, and he invented DNA sequencing technology, so you could actually read the DNA itself. And all this technology only entered the public realm when it was really applied to plants, so to food. So 1983, first transgenic plant, and most people start to get more acquainted with these technologies when, well, things like Boo Haman were made. It's an animal that was made in the Netherlands, and it expresses, there's a gene that is a human, and the female offspring of this bull produces this enzyme in the milk. It led to some controversy. Actually, the Dutch law had to be changed to allow this animal to reproduce. Actually, it was not allowed at first. And then in popular culture, people got confronted with this technology, I think mostly through Jurassic Park, 1993. And this started, of course, triggered a lot of fantasies about what life science technologies and especially genetics could do. And then in 1994, the flavor saver tomato reached the market. And this is a tomato that is slightly genetically altered, so it can stay, has a much longer shelf life, as you can see. Normal tomatoes only last for about 10 days, and flavor saver tomatoes last for 45 days. And the same type of products are still being introduced. In the United States, you now have Arctic apples, apples that don't turn brown when you slice them. These type of inventions are taking place all the time. 1996, Dolly the sheep was cloned. I think many of you know it. And if you're really interested in this type of developments, then I would recommend to visit the Center for Post-Natural History. It's curated by Rich Bell in Pittsburgh. And he collects specimens of all these special animals and plants and bacteria that are made by humans in labs by changing their genetic layout. So, for example, the goat in the front is a goat that produces biosteel milk. So it has spider silk molecules in the milk, and that can be used to make yarn and super strong fabrics. Another revolution was in 2003 when biotech was more standardized, and now this is the last part of my bit of history. Since, well, arguably 2015, also before that, there's CRISPR-Cas9, which is a pretty big hype in the biotech scene right now. It's a tool with which you can edit DNA very precisely and very efficiently, and it has very little side effects. So now we are kind of in the age of being able to modify genetic material very precisely, and we could also think about what implications it could have for our own species, for the environment that we live in. So in today's biotech, what's interesting, most of the time, the technology is split up into 4 categories, which is kind of artificial, but it's the way it is. So people often talk about green biotechnology, red biotechnology, blue or white, depending on the application. So it's the same technology, but also the way people relate to these technologies really depends on the context. So when you apply bioengineering to plants or to food, people tend to have a very other type of relationship with it than when you apply it to yeast in a bioreactor in the white biotechnology. And this is developing very rapidly through basically driven by 2 major innovations. So DNA editing and sequencing is the curve on the left. The blue curve is the cost of reading DNA. It's an exponential curve, so the costs are dropping very fast. And CRISPR is the technology that can be used to edit DNA, and this is a graph that shows the number of publications in which it's mentioned. So you could see, like, since 2015 is really being picked up. And this is also reasons for concern. The Dutch government performed a study on these new types of technologies early at the end of 2016, and basically it already announced that today's regulations will not suffice on regulating this. And I want to touch upon a few of those latest technologies to really show what the problem is with that. So first one is next generation sequencing. Next generation sequencing is a technology which you can read DNA really fast. You have to imagine that all the DNA in a human cell was sequenced for the first time in the year 2003. It took about 13 years to get there. Now with one of these machines in this room, you can do it in less than 3 days. So that's kind of less than 20 years time, the technology has been developing super fast. And there are places like this is Beijing Genomics Institute in China, where they have rooms full of these machines reading DNA continuously and trying to find interesting properties and of course maybe commercialize it or use it or own it. At the same time, using this knowledge, you can edit living organisms. This is a simple experiment where a rodent has been made glow in the dark. Of course, this is more or less harmless, or well, harmless. It's not a very serious intervention, but you can use the same technology to edit our own germlines. So, of course, eliminate diseases that are heritable, but also enhance humans in another way. And currently, just a couple months ago, the first gene therapy was approved by FDA in the United States. So, in this therapy, your own cells are taken from your body, genetically modified, and then reintroduced into your body, in this case, to fight cancer. But it's quite a big revolution that is now actually possible to do that, so to genetically alter already a mature human being. Another example is the gene-drive mosquito. So nobody really likes mosquitoes, of course, so it's not a very... it's an easy target to try to eliminate from the environment. And using this CRISPR technology, you can build in a property that prevents them from reproducing. And this property can be made in such a way that it's spread throughout the population all the time. So every offspring has the same property whenever they mate with a wild type. So you can release these genetically modified mosquitoes and thereby eliminate the species from an environment. So then the question comes up, who gets to decide which species is allowed to live in which ecosystem? And then moving more to the synthetic biology approach, so trying to create life out of non-living materials, so-called bottom-up biotechnology movement. This is a movie of the minimal cell made by J. Greg Venter Institute. They're trying to reduce the complexity of living cells as much as they can. At the moment, there are about 140 genes, so genetic parts necessary to create a living cell that still functions. We don't really know what those 140 parts do, or at least the majority is unknown, but they are growing and it works. And another trend that you see developing is so-called soft robotics or 3D bioprinting. So small robots made out of soft materials inspired by nature that have no mechanical parts, but just chemical reactions that make them move and change their shape. We can maybe imagine if you merge those two technologies or multiple of these, that you can make very small, creepy things very fast. And then ultimately, I think this is also an example of where this technology is taking us, the artificial womb research, where they take prematurely born animals and then fully grow them in so-called biobags. This, of course, this boundary is also being pushed back more and more all the time. Basically making us often feel a little bit uncomfortable. At least it makes me feel uncomfortable sometimes. So the big question is, with all these advancements, and you can call it alchemy, you can also call it just science. What do we expect from this technology? What do we want it to take us? Because that's often what is missing in this dialogue. Of course, you can say, okay, we'll just innovate for the sake of innovation and try to invent new things all the time. But having a clear vision on where we want to take this technology, that's often lacking. And of course, you can split this question up into sub-questions. Think about what is the status of these new technologies? Are they still genetically modified organisms or not. There are many different techniques that are somehow derived from it and cannot, technically speaking, are not genetic engineering. What does the natural still mean in this world? Who do we entrust this technology to? Who owns it? How do we ensure some kind of economical justice in the world if some companies or parties own living things and others don't? And how do you secure yourself or an ecosystem against a party that intends to change it or modify it? These are just a number of questions that you can ask. I'm afraid I can't answer them, or most of them. But it's interesting that the Dutch Committee for Genetic Modification has done a study and asked Dutch people about their opinion. So they did a big survey, over 1,000 participants. And what is very interesting to first, they asked people, do you know about these developments? Well, most of the people don't. They have no idea that this is happening. And then, once they're more introduced to it, it really depends on which type of application the technology is used to, whether people, how people relate to it. And that, of course, is difficult because at the moment technology is regulated based on the technology itself and not based on the application. And when people have different opinions about the applications, then the current model doesn't work. Basically, if you move from today's technology to the future, the only control system that we have right now is safety. There's a so-called precautionary principle in place in the European Union that says, well, whenever a technology is safe, then we can use it. But of course, there are and the rest is left up to the market. So okay, we'll just, for example, label all the products that have been modified, and then it's up to you as a consumer to decide what you want. But the question is, of course, what type of world will we live then in the future? Is it, will we have a diverse group, for example, of people, or just ultimate workforces that are fit for the type of work that we need at some point in time? And, well, this is just one major question. I think if you, for example, take the theory of Kate Raworth, her donut economy theory, where she says, well, you cannot talk about sustainable economic growth if you don't take into account the outer layer, outer boundaries of our economic system, so the ecological ceiling and our social foundations, which is the inner layer. You have to somehow make sure that innovations are in between those two boundaries. The question is, how are we going to do that with biotechnology, and how are these innovations going to, for example, ensure social equity or equality or our health? And for that, I think we need more regulations and discussions on where we want this technology to take us and how we can deal with that. I look very much forward to the discussion, and if you want to stay in touch, then these are my contact details, and the Rathenau Institute has made a number of reports on this if you want to dive really into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pieter, for this thought-provoking and maybe a bit nauseating talk. Our last speaker today, or this afternoon for this panel, is Krystal Boehner. She's an artist, researcher, recovering academic, which I'm very curious to hear more about, and curator, currently based in Paris, at least for a little while. Then you have to find her in Scotland. She's also contributing editor of Icon magazine and Metropolis, writes a regular series on museum stores for Apollo, and contributes to Diseño, Helsinki Design Week, and Wallpaper, amongst others. She's got a very diverse set of interests, so I'm really curious and looking forward to her talk. Please help me in welcoming Krystal.
Thank you. I should say that this is the first time I've ever tried to give a talk through a raging migraine, so you'll really have to forgive me. Trying to hold it together. I think it'll be fine, but we'll see how it goes. So I've been feeling a little bit like the token historian amongst a bunch of futurists. I'm going to be talking quite a lot about, I really want to talk about the history of alchemy, so that's what I'm talking about. So this is a still from a German film released in 1934 called Gold. And it's a kind of take on alchemy in which the film's protagonist, who's a German scientist called Mr. Holk, he's effectively coerced into changing lead into gold for this nefarious Scottish industrialist. And this is their laboratory setup, and amusingly, it's underneath the North Sea. And Holk eventually succeeds, of course, in transmuting the lead into gold, and he tells the industrialist, and the industrialist is thrilled, and they announce that they're going to put this gold into, they're effectively going to try and mass produce the gold and circulate it into society. And you have this great newspaper montage, newspaper headline montage scene. And the first day, it's like general prosperity forecast, great. The second day, significant boost to world economy anticipated, but then a couple of days go by, and you have stock market panic before like total global catastrophe. And I'm kicking off with this film because I think it quite nicely encompasses a sort of weird complexity and a lot of the messy contradictions inherent in alchemy. The protagonist, he's driven by a desire for gold, but also knowledge, how to create this gold. But you also have quite a nice morality tale about ethics and the social repercussions of then what you do with this product. And Holk, like a lot of other alchemists before him, he really privileges experimentation as a means of obtaining information, but he's also guided by a strong ethical position. So what happens is at the end of the film, sorry, it's a bit of a spoiler, but at the end of the film, they completely destroy the laboratory, destroying the material itself, but also the knowledge of how to produce this material. And it's this ethical component that I'm talking about when I say the spirit of alchemy. And I think it's really interesting because one often gets the sense with things like biotech and new technologies that, you know, we're starting from ground zero with ethics, and that it's like an entirely new set of ethical questions. But actually something that's really interesting about alchemy is it shows that these are super old questions, and it's just the technologies that are new. And questions like, as we just saw, what limits should be placed on our ability to change nature? Is natural intrinsically better than artificial? Who has the right to change nature, and to what degree? And these are all questions that alchemy and alchemists and their critics have been dealing with for centuries. So, okay, what are we actually talking about when we talk about alchemy? And this is a big reason why I wanted to talk about this, because I think the terms sometimes get thrown around without necessarily a respect for the fact that they have incredibly rich and complex histories. And actually, it's a really difficult question to just say, to answer what is alchemy, because it has a very long history, centuries. There are also multiple traditions. You have Chinese, you have Indian, you have Arabic, you have Western traditions, and they all have completely different, they all have their own particularities. And I'm mostly going to be talking about Western alchemy, but it's important to note that you have a huge tradition. And with Western alchemy, you also have the fact that people like Carl Jung in the 19th century have been incredibly influential in, I think, shaping popular perceptions of alchemy as something which is almost entirely to do with like the dream world or the mystical and the occult. And then what's interesting is that from the 1970s and 80s, you start seeing with historians of science a kind of attempt to revise the history of alchemy as a kind of proto-chemistry. And these historians really start looking almost exclusively at what alchemists were actually doing in the laboratory, decoding their recipes, copying some of their experiments with actually quite interesting results. And I think as a consequence, maybe we've perhaps slightly overbalanced from Jung. And the dominant argument in contemporary alchemy history today is so concerned with kind of restoring the reputation of alchemy as like an authentic science that there's a terror at anything that even mentions spirituality. And the problem with that, I think, is that spirituality, it's the home of ethics and alchemy. So I'm going to try and define alchemy as effectively three kind of component parts. And the first is that alchemy is a theory of natural philosophy, helpfully illustrated by this marvelous tombstone. And as above, so below, it's a phrase that first appears in the Emerald Tablet by Hermes Trismegistus. And even though it's thought by medieval alchemists that this text dates back to kind of Greco-Roman Egypt, the first time it actually appeared was in the Arabic alchemical corpus from the sort of 6th to 9th century. And it was later translated into Latin in the 12th century, and it basically became the kind of philosophical cornerstone, this text underpinning Western alchemy. And there are loads of different alchemic interpretations of what as above, so below actually means. But for example, you have like the idea that the influence of the 7 known planets at the time, or how that influence manifested itself in the creation of the 7 metals on Earth. You also had a much more like Neoplatonic conception that you have perfected form above and kind of messy matter below. But the general point is that alchemists are speculating about the nature of matter. They're asking questions like, what is matter? And then these theoretical speculations are guiding more practical experimentation. And there's also a super important point to be made about the fact that nature is God's creation, and it's God's will to bestow the secrets of this creation on whoever he wants. And one of the cornerstones of ethics in alchemy revolves around the fact that God's not going to bestow these secrets on anyone who's not worthy. And alchemists write quite a lot about the need for virtue and disinterestedness in their texts. And secondly, the second component is that alchemy is also practical experimentation, right? Okay, and this is specifically linked to transmutation, but also to medicine. And in scholarly circles, transmutation is referred to as chrysopoeia, which is Greek for to make gold. But it's actually really interesting because a lot of the early alchemists were not purely interested in making gold and metals. They were also doing experiments with loads of organic substances like semen, blood, urine. And it's not until the Islamic alchemists from the 7th century onwards, and this is an engraving after a 19th century painting of Rhazes, to use his Latinized name, that you really start to see a focus exclusively on metals, as well as the kind of perfection of laboratory practices like distillation and extraction, and also the kind of incorporation of mathematics into alchemy. And you also get really heated ethical debates that start kicking off. So you have a generation after Rhazes, you have Avicenna, who's one of the most significant figures of the Islamic Golden Age. And he's kind of takes against transmutation because from his point of view, like, nature is God's perfect creation and man is never going to get anywhere near that. So it's sort of, it's immoral, basically, if you're going to attempt to do such a thing. And experimentation in alchemy is also linked to medicine. This is sort of popularly known as the Elixir of Life, and everyone thinks it's about like trying to live forever. But most alchemists they're not interested in that. They're not really trying to create a substance that's going to let them live forever. And the medical branch of alchemy kicks off in the 13th century with people like the English philosopher Roger Bacon. And he picks up on the work being done by the Persian alchemists with distillation. And his reasoning is that, okay, if distillation is about separating the pure from the impure in certain substances, in doing that, you're perfecting the substance and thus imbuing it with kind of spiritual as well as physical properties, and those things could be beneficial to the body. But it's actually with this guy here, who's a Paracelsus, 16th century German philosopher, who's treating a patient in the frontispiece it was a posthumously published text. And this is where medical alchemy really kind of kicks off. And Paracelsus is not interested whatsoever in transmutation, which he actually thinks is quite ethically dubious. He's only really interested in alchemy as something that can be used to prepare pharmaceuticals or explain bodily functions. And he advocates for practice of medicine, which I really love. He kind of takes against Galen and Aristotle, who he calls corrupt and bookish. But you have to remember at this time that like medicine is still largely theoretical. It's still really into Galen's theory of the four humors, and it's the idea that illness is something, it's about an imbalance within the body, something wrong within the body. And then by contrast, Paracelsus, he's looking at illness as something that originates outside the body and how you can treat that. And for him, his reasoning is like, okay, if the body is a chemical system and metals are the kind of key element in the universe, then clearly there should be some links between the two, and that's why alchemy is potentially useful for him. And the third and final component part to kind of trying to get at what alchemy actually is to do with textual scholarship. These are just two 17th century paintings of alchemists in their labs, and you can see there's texts everywhere, chaotic. And contemporary scholars of alchemy, they disagree about loads and loads of things, and one thing that they're all in agreement on is the importance of textual scholarship. And texts are where alchemists are getting chemical recipes, is where they're getting guidance on experiments. The texts kind of reinforce natural philosophy, or they argue for certain ethical positions. I think obviously there's a link that needs to be made here to the kind of infamous secrecy and obscurity of the alchemic texts. And part of this, I think, is linked to, well, part of it is linked to kind of charlatanism, and if you don't really know what you're doing and you're making stuff up, of course you make that as obscure as possible. That's the negative interpretation. And part of that is linked to the idea that, as I mentioned earlier, that God's only bestowing his secrets on the worthy, and obscuring is part of a way to help determine who's worthy. But there's also, I think, an acknowledgement of responsibility for knowledge obtained. And finally, the idea that acquiring knowledge is a process. And one might complain, as some later would-be alchemists did, that it's a kind of intellectual power grab or an unbalanced power relationship. But I think that from an alchemist's perspective, it's much more about a respect for experience in the Latin sense of the word, which is to test and to try. And also a respect for the power of knowledge itself, which you can see quite clearly in one of the mottos of Renaissance alchemists, which is one book opens another, which I think is really nice. And alchemy has its heyday in Europe in the 17th century, and there are loads of super interesting, I don't want to say reasons why, but maybe coincidental historical events. If you want to know about that, you can ask me later. But around 1700 is where you start to see the emergence of modern chemistry and the disappearance of alchemy. And 20th and 21st century narratives maintain that it was because increasing scientific knowledge effectively ruled out transmutation. But this certainly didn't stop people like Robert Boyle, and as we heard from Warren on whenever it was, Isaac Newton as well, and this is Boyle here. And Boyle's popularly known as the father of chemistry, but he was obsessed with transmutation. But Boyle, one thing he didn't like was the obscurity of the text, and he thought that it needed to be much clearer and much more open so that knowledge could be shared between practitioners more easily, and that's something that then becomes very visible in the emerging chemistry. And actually, again, the decline of alchemy and its exclusion from chemistry, it's much more likely to have been linked to social rather than scientific concerns. And again, there's loads of evidence from contemporary historians that there wasn't necessarily a clean-cut divorce between alchemy and chemistry. And you have well into the 19th and 20th century really, really fascinating and weird tales of, especially things around transmutation, within the academy, of like people saying that they've discovered gold, and discussions and debates around this. So, okay, to get to the subtitle of the panel, how does this history then reflect our current relationship around materials transformation and power? And to go back to this idea of the virtues and intentions of the alchemic practitioner, I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the idea of the alchemist ethics. And particularly, I want to contrast the way the alchemists talk about ethics with the way that a lot of, at least publicly, contemporary scientists and technologists talk about ethics. And I've already mentioned this idea that some contemporary historians of alchemy have kind of overbalanced to emphasize the proto-scientific nature of alchemy at the expense of its kind of ethics and spirituality. For them, that stuff is like purely 19th century phenomenon, and that's sort of what I'm cheekily referring to here. But when you actually open the alchemic text, when you read the alchemic text, there's a huge concern with the ethical and spiritual frameworks. And often these are front and center in the opening pages of the text. And do we take this at face value? Is it ritual? Is it performance? I don't know, but it's very visibly present. And I came across this lovely paper by the Italian chemist Giuseppe Del Re called Technology and the Spirit of Alchemy, which resonated a lot with what I've been thinking about in relation to this talk, and I borrowed The Spirit of Alchemy from him for the title. And Del Rey argues that although the transition from the kind of mysticism of alchemy to the rigor of chemistry is often credited to the abandonment of the religious aspects of alchemy, that it's actually been the elimination of this spirit of alchemy that's really contributed to a lot of widespread misuses of technology. And like many early modern alchemists, Del Rey, he's pretty into narratives of technological progress, which I certainly, and I think a lot of us, find quite problematic, but there's nevertheless something quite valid in his insistence that science and technology lost something quite important when they jettisoned the alchemist sense of moral responsibility for like technological know-how above everything else. And to compare with contemporary science and technology, you have this like not my responsibility trope. And I had loads and loads of examples, but I'm just going to give you one. And this is last year, the scientist Kathy Nyken was granted UK government approval to genetically alter human embryos up to the first 7 days of development. And as far as I know, this is the first time such permission had been granted in the UK. It's possible, of course, that this research can be used to screen for embryos with genetic problems, but it's also the kind of technology that's given rise to a lot of discussions around designer babies. And when she applied for this license in 2005, she said, "It's up to society to decide what is acceptable. Science will merely inform what may be possible." And something that I think it's really important to draw out here, if it's not completely obvious, is that not taking an ethical position it is taking an ethical position. And if you're formulating research questions, applying for government approval for your research, carrying out experiments that could potentially, change the face of future society, then those are actions which at the very least betray ethical assumptions, even if those assumptions are not clearly stated, as in a kind of quote like this. And I think for me, the idea that science is this completely neutral thing that just simply presents a series of options is kind of absurd. So much so that, more Jurassic Park, so much so that I've kind of taken to thinking of it as the Dr. Malcolm phenomenon, which this is the other side of the Jurassic Park thing, which is that, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, that they never stopped to think of whether they should. But what strikes me as super interesting about this kind of not my responsibility trope is the way it then becomes entrenched within larger structures. And you wind up with this separation of the scientist or technologist as a truth-seeking experimentalist, regardless of the cost, and society as moralist, embedded. And you see this in things like external ethics boards at tech companies. And I think Google's DeepMind is a really interesting example of this, because it was actually part of the acquisition conditions when Google acquired DeepMind that stipulated the necessity of creating an external ethics board. That has been handled in quite a weird way. It's been kept quite secret. None of the names of the board members have been released, but that's a slightly separate thing. Because what I find really striking is that although, I don't know, maybe it seems like a really good idea to have these external checks and balances, it also seems to remove any sense of individual ethical responsibility from the engineers and designers actually involved in DeepMind. It's like outsourcing their conscience. And it says that, okay, you have the development of the AI technology over here and the related ethical questions about these technologies over here, and they don't really have anything to do with each other. And I think that's really beautifully crystallized in this statement from an anonymous DeepMind spokesperson about the nature of the ethics board. And again, I know our society, it's like pretty committed to specialization, but there's something quite concerning that the people developing the technology are not the same people developing the kind of ethical questions and ethical systems around those technologies. And moreover, that is, like, as you can see here, that DeepMind opts to spend its time and energy and money getting the ethics people up to speed with the AI rather than the AI people up to speed with the ethics. I think it's quite telling. And to return to the figure of the alchemist with my amazing chart, you have no separation, right? Like deeply, deeply embedded within the alchemic text is this idea that perfection of nature, manifested as alchemic success, it's only possible in conjunction with the perfection of the practitioner. And although, as I mentioned previously, within alchemy, the way that I guess the moral system which they're using, it's perfection of the self as it relates to God. But there's also strong moral instruction not to do anything damaging to society that appears regularly in the text. And again, I could have picked from quite a lot of different examples, but I'm just going to finish with an extract from a 17th century alchemical text. And this extract, it's from the second chapter of a Renaissance text, which was purported to have been written by Hermes Trismegistus of Emerald Tablet fame. That's him there giving laws to the Egyptians from a mosaic on the floor of the Cathedral of Siena. And he's like super granddaddy of alchemy in the West, and it's a canonical or a nearly canonical text, so I think it's quite emblematic. But he says, "It behooves him, therefore, who would be introduced to this hidden wisdom, to free himself from the hidden usurpations of vice, and to be just and good, and of a sound reason, ready at hand to help mankind, of a serene countenance, diligent to save, and be himself a patient guardian of the arcane secrets of philosophy." And I think it hints at this idea of individual responsibility, which extends to an ethical position of causing no ill will to society. And if you want to borrow a well-known tech company motto, it's "don't be evil," right? But instead of like inventing something socially destructive, then flinging that thing into society and then going, "Oh shit, like what have we done?" You have an ethical code which effectively cautions against such behavior written into canonical texts, which is then repeated throughout the canon. And the last phrase as well, I think it reiterates that part of this responsibility is for an alchemist to keep potentially harmful alchemical knowledge, as well as its products and processes, out of the circulation of society. And again, you could say, well, maybe this is a kind of intellectual power grab, but it's exactly the same rationale that leads Hulk in the film Gold to completely destroy the laboratory at the end of the film. And it's an acknowledgement that of the social consequences of certain materials or forms of knowledge, and then taking it some kind of individual responsibility for the prevention of those consequences. And I think that what the alchemic texts show is that alchemy is the combination of textual scholarship and practical experimentation, but that both of those things, an absolutely crucial component is that both of those things are enfolded within a kind of framework of ethics and spirituality. And to go back to the DeepMind example, from an alchemy point of view, there's not a difference between the engineers and the ethics board. They're one and the same. And fine, we might not always agree with the alchemist's ethical position or even what that position is in service to, and I'm not then necessarily suggesting that this becomes a kind of legitimate argument for developing AI or biotech or whatever other thing, but that, as Del Rey claims in his paper, I think that maybe we've lost something super important in abandoning this spirit of alchemy within science and technology, and perhaps that's something we should look at getting back. That's the spirit. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I'll invite all of the speakers to join me up here. And in the interest of time, I'll open it up immediately to the floor to ask questions. It feels so uncomfortable to go and sit here now, so I'll just go and sit here. That also means that if you have questions for each other, we're very happy to just jump in, ask those. Is there already one from the floor? Sorry, I can't really see. Oh, yep. There's two there, one there. Okay, then I'll just shut up.
Hi, I think this is a question to Krystal. So because just now your presentation, I feel is more like a call out to the modern alchemists, maybe like scientists, engineers to have the individual responsibility. However, how do you think about the balance or the proportion for individual responsibility and the certain group of people like the funding bodies, which allows individual scientists to do the research? how much is a proportion from them to have the responsibility? So that's why I wonder. Like based on the history you know about the alchemy and also the modern, like the current situation.
How do I make this work? It's working. Okay, amazing. I think it's a great question, but it's like a sort of obvious question. And I think I was always really conscious when putting my talk together that it's very heavily leaning on the individual, the individual responsibility, and that's partly because of the history of alchemy. But also within alchemy, you have the very obvious point that like being an alchemist is expensive and it requires money and it requires funding, and that's why you have within the European tradition anyway, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. Most large-scale alchemical experiments are happening at court within the kind of royal context. There's like a prince funding them, but it's all. And then you immediately think, okay, well, the prince is just trying to fill his coffers and get loads of gold. But you actually come across a lot of really, really interesting documents where you have individual alchemists petitioning the prince to fund their experiments, and the kind of, again, the language that they use and the way that they explain their motivation, it's so there's one that I'm thinking of in particular, and he's like, I want to come to your court and set up my lab so that I can help you get money to fix your roads, ensure that all your citizens have adequate clean water supplies, and can be treated medically and have good educations. And I'm quite cynical, really. It didn't come across in that presentation at all. But whether you take any of that at face value, what the actual motivations are, I have no idea. But it's very important that society does have to play a key role in deciding what we want to do with these things. But I guess my main point is that needs to happen at the beginning, before we even, it sounds a bit crazy to say before we even know what some of these technologies are, but when you see a lot of things like DeepMind, they've just recently announced the creation of a totally separate ethics research hub to deal with questions around AI. But again, it just feels like that's coming so late. That should have been built in from the very, very, very beginning. I'm not kind of trying to retroactively or retrospectively apply some ethical questions and discussion. I think it needs to start at the very beginning, even if it's difficult to determine where the beginning is.
Because sometimes the beginning is how the media release the information to the public, but maybe the funding bodies of government or whatever, they already stopped the beginning 5 years ago, or 5 years before, or 10 years before the public knows about it. So,
yeah. But I think, I had a very interesting conversation there's some people here from the BBC's R&D department, and they were telling me that, I sort of mentioned this to them, and they were saying, well, the BBC in its code of charter, I don't know how you call it, charter, that it actually has quite strong and very clear for various different elements of the BBC, but it has them all kind of written into its charter. It has a code of conduct and a code of ethics written into its charter. And I think probably a lot of funding bodies and things do as well. To be honest, I don't really know. But I think that's quite an interesting model that could perhaps be looked to for other applications.
Maybe, Pieter, you want to respond to this question as well, from your perspective?
Yeah, all right. So it's quite an interesting question, because at the moment, in the Netherlands at least, there's a similar discussion around the regulation of biotechnologies. One of the suggestions that was brought up was to have a broad societal debate about what we would like to do or not. But of course, there's also resistance against that, because actually most people find it unfair to ask this question to the public, because can we really judge this, and are we supposed to? How are we supposed to judge these technologies, and in what context exactly? And this is also what you see from this survey, that people have different opinions based on the context or the application of a certain technology. So that's, I think up to policymakers, also the scientists themselves, also to make sure that the questions are really crisp and clear, and not just a broad question like, hey, let's talk about artificial intelligence. like, yeah, what is your opinion on artificial intelligence? That's not really something that you can ask to people. I think that's an important notion. Yeah.
But then it's quite interesting how often, like, there was this great, actually I saw through Natalie, who was tweeting it like last week or something, about this announcement that some AI researchers, maybe in Cambridge, were getting very close to being able to determine the identity of someone's face, even if it was partially covered. And I think that is like a really, so it's what you're saying, it's like the application, right? Yeah. So he was like, I was developing this technology thinking purely about criminals and like helping the criminal justice system. But this article was saying, okay, well, it can be used to determine the identity of protesters, for example, who have their faces covered, or it could be used by, you know, horrible governments, agents to, again, for similar thing. And so, yes, of course, you have the like question of the application and how the technology is applied. But the fact that the researcher very explicitly said he had never even considered any alternative possibilities for his technology, and he was only thinking of its use in the criminal justice system. And I think that's ridiculous. Like, to not even be able to like imagine those alternatives from the beginning, I think like there has got to be a better way to approach some of these questions.
Füsun?
Yeah, I think it's very good that you're mentioning this, because I think in a way, it's also a very naive discussion to have, because who informs machines or who informs algorithms? It's a human being. So, of course, you can say as a researcher, you can say, oh, I never thought of it. And I would like to believe that, and it's fine. But then on the other hand, we also have to discuss, you know, how do we repeat our behavior in real life, also in the digital realm or with the technologies that we create, which is, of course, you know, if I am not aware of my own racism or sexism or, you know, gender binary thought or the heteronormative matrix that I'm living in, of course, as a scientist or whatever I am, architect, whatever, it really doesn't matter. I will continue to produce that kind of, you know, algorithm or the way I see the world, or the, you know, my facial recognition system will, of course, be based on whatever I feed it. So I think, I guess that's something just to underline what you're saying, but not only on in a way that you know, we're calling out the ethical finger, like no, don't do it. But I think it's very much inherent to us, and I think that's why we have to educate ourselves in many different realms before we enter this sort of discussion. You know, oh, you know, what were the scientists thinking, and then to leave this to the side, I would like to just say a little bit about the legal text that always follows inventions. I think that, in a way, it's normal almost. I'm not saying it's okay, but I think it's, of course, you know, it's almost like with the internet and how do we use the internet? Is the internet solely there to be an open source for us? And we pay with it, you know, we pay for it with data, or is the internet only, or, you know, what is the resolution of the state? Does the state have a higher resolution about the things that the state sees or the government than we do? And what does it mean? And who is chasing whom? So if we as a protester might have a higher resolution, the state will always try to follow us, right? Also with the technologies. So in a way, with the research and the legal text and how we limit the ethical innovations, it's almost a little bit like that. It's almost this hide and seek, or how do you say that, the cat chase, you know? So the cat and mouse play. So I guess that's my point, that it's so complex, and I think it's almost inherent in its nature that it will be like that, and I think we have to just be aware of it. No?
Okay, another question from the floor. There were more hands up. Yeah, there's one up there.
Okay, I think it's kind of answered because you just, it's for Pieter, because you just talked about the application, but still, I'm going to ask it. Because when I saw the lamp research, I was thinking which company or who would ask to have that researched, like who funded it, or maybe nobody funded it, and for what purpose?
Yeah, well, that particular research that's done at the University of Tokyo, so in Japan. So I'm not sure how they're funded, but I would assume that it's a governmental national science fund. So yeah, and of course the intentions there, I think if you would ask the scientists, why are you doing this? Well, of course to cure diseases and to make sure that everybody's born healthy. And I also recognize this, having these conversations with these type of people and then trying to turn it around. And they often say, oh, we never considered this other possibility. So that's quite disturbing. Yeah.
Yes, one more question there.
So I would like to ask a question to all of you about some other axes that some of you touched upon, is the accessibilities, because Krystal talked about how this knowledge production used to be very secretive and very secluded, and you focused on the wordiness of it. But Pieter, in the introduction, you introduced as also being busy with this open source applications of this biotechnology. So I was wondering how this accessibility changes how this knowledge is applied. Like, what are the possibilities and what are the risks? Or one possible question is, for example, about the danger of it. So restricting the resources for making bombs, for example, is relatively easy because there's particular elements that you need, and that you can outlaw them. You can make sure that at the selling point they're not available. But so in that kind of context, how can the resources for this kind of knowledge be restricted or not? Like, how does this relate of this biotechnology, algorithms, this kind of stuff?
Yeah. So in general, I'm really a proponent of open technologies. I would say there's a big difference between access and openness. You can make open documentation about your experiment, but if you write it in a certain jargon, then it's only, let's say, accessible or usable by a certain small group of people. But mostly, I think it's a good thing because openness, clearly shows who owns a certain technology or shares ownership, and with ownership comes accountability, I believe. But when we talk about artificial intelligence and, for example, self-learning, deep learning algorithms, then openness doesn't cut it anymore because you still don't understand what the algorithm is doing, even if you would open it up. So that would not lead to any more accountability. So I know that DARPA has this program on explainable artificial intelligence, XAI. So the algorithm has to explain itself while it's evolving. Maybe that we could put that into a certain law. Say, hey, well, as soon as you're using these type of algorithms, make sure that they explain themselves. Otherwise, there's no way to have a certain accountability in these algorithms. Yeah.
More responses from the panel?
Again, when you put a 20-minute talk together, you make everything seem quite neat and tidy, and also my head is really killing me. But I quite agree with a lot of what you were saying, and I sort of, in an ideal, utopian, brilliant, wonderful world, it would be not so much of a consideration, or we would have a massive cultural shift and everyone would become instantly ethical, and that's what I'd really like to happen. But barring that, I think it's a really interesting and extremely difficult question, and frankly I don't even really know how you begin or where you begin to kind of tackle it. But I guess there's definitely, I think the open source, that's one really interesting possibility, but also it's really industry dependent, it's really technology dependent, it's really culturally dependent. Also, there is the sense that things are moving so fast, which at the moment, and things are developing so quickly, and then something is launched onto the market, or with technology in particular, before anybody has really had a chance to kind of process what some possible outcomes might be. There's a really funny thing I saw this summer is Tony Fadell, who is the founder of Nest and also involved in developing the early iPod and iPhone. And he was giving a part of a panel lecture this summer in London on kind of the future promised by all of these amazing technologies. And he was again, talking a lot about how when they were developing these things, they were young, single guys with no kids, no steady relationships. And that now that they're all kind of grown up and they have families and kids of their own, and like seeing the way that their kids are completely obsessed in the way that they use these technologies, and they were like, oh yeah, God, maybe if we would have had kids at the time when we like developed these technologies, we would have gone about it in a completely different way. And so then there's something to be said there for the way that we do share information and how that can possibly be used beneficially for developing technologies. But yeah, I don't know. It's a hard call.
I wanted to shift the topic again to materials, but maybe I should say something about technology. I think Paul Virilio was quite clear on, technology and speed and the invention of technologies. So I think that's, of course, one reference. And then there is another one, a beautiful text by the group AIR, which I do not fully agree upon because I think they also wrote it in a quite, hastily manner, but that it's still published, and I can recommend to anyone who's interested in, the smart household. It's a text that was published in the Harvard Design Magazine. It's called Family. It's written, I think, in a sort of Scandinavian way, but it talks about, the first computing systems in a household, and then it touches upon Nest, etc., what you just mentioned.
In reconsidering what we've heard here and how this panel was set up in looking into the term of alchemy or the early alchemist and relating it to designers, creative practitioners working with complex systems technologies, and whether this metaphor comparison is relevant and interesting, I have the feeling that, yes, it is, not in the least because of this desire to work with materials and the transformative qualities of materials, and we can go back into that a little bit, but also what I learned and what I'm happy we talked about more here today is this item that, or this aspect of spirituality and ethics within the spiritual that was so present within the alchemist practices, and that is kind of either not present or present as an afterthought or outsourced to someone else even. And that debate on how you connect that, whether you bring the technology to the ethics or the ethics to the technology, I think is a super valuable addition to this debate of relating alchemy to the comparing the practice of alchemy and the tradition of alchemy to contemporary practices. We have 1 more minute, so either we ask Füsun to talk about materials, or you'll bring it back to materials for a while. Yep.
I can do one quick shift regarding the film and the trailer and why the figure of the blacksmith, why I mentioned that, and it really becomes essential if we think about labor and what it made us work. So Deleuze and Guattari in their 1980 A Thousand Plateaus book, they say metal was the very matter that broke the limbs of the human body into the human being. A person available for work. So it took metal or matter to make the human body a commodity for labor in the first instance, and that I find really beautiful. So the blacksmith, the original, while physically executing his or her work, had to perform certain accountability in that sense, right? Like Taylor would say, measuring every step that you take. But so then I went into the text and I did a little graphic design exercise of 2 minutes, just replacing every time in the text when the blacksmith was mentioned, I X'd it out and I put the word trader on top of it and read the text again, and all of a sudden the word, the text functioned still. I mean, had I replaced it with something else, it might have as well, but with the trade, it particularly worked well. So this is why then I start talking about, how through the material we're moved around, and how material is essential to the very notion of labor, which then, of course, we can talk about this, but also we can always relate it back to digital alchemy, which we're also talking about, all the black liquid screens, and to connect it to your upcoming exhibition, on rare earth metals, all of those technologies that, the rare earth metals, for example, make all of our devices thinner and faster, etc. So, but this is the material aspect and how matter really informs our labor function, or bodily function. So the corporeal, that I was also interested in that, I guess.
And I think with that we came full circle back to the film. So please put your hands one more time together for this beautiful panel.